Well, from what I can see, first of all, the first administration you had Colin Powell. As I said before, I consider him probably the most important figure in the last 20 years in political military affairs in the United States, despite that he didn't, that he was basically pushed aside in the State Department, where he was loved by the FSOs. But Cheney basically, during that time, had a good relationship with Powell. In fact, they clashed on several occasions. And Powell backed off, and he said, frankly, he backed off. The thing that bothers the military, I think, was best stated by Powell when he what's the name, our former Secretary of State, Albright. They were having a meeting on what to do with Bosnia. And as they're sitting around, Albright says, well, Colin, why not use those soldiers? Let them go. And Colin said, I almost had an aneurysm. These are people. These are people who are going to die. And you don't send people in uniform in unless you're damn sure that it's necessary. And here she was, just these are 10 soldiers. Go send them in, take them in. And Powell blew his cork. And they didn't do it then. But that's the problem that you run into in Washington. And it's not Democrat or Republican. It's civilians who don't understand how the military thinks, or else to assume that they're playthings. They're not. I mean, you talk to somebody whose husband didn't come back. Find out real quick. Don't use them unless you damn well need them. And I think that so far, I'm going to say honestly, I consider myself sort of a slightly conservative Republican, which may sound strange right in this. But I cannot find fault with any of Obama's appointments. None. I mean, I know the far left doesn't like him very much. But frankly, from somebody who's trying to be in the middle, I cannot fault any of his national security appointments, period. Some are more liberal than I would care to be, but they're all solid. And I think that keeping Gates is a brilliant idea. Keeping Mike Mullen as chairman is a brilliant idea. What Gates has done is rebuild trust in the military. And that is so damn important. I mean, if people say, well, you either reward them or you pound them. No, you don't do that. That's not what leadership is. Leadership is getting people who want to follow you. That's what leadership is all about. That's when you go in the military. I mean, I can order him to go do that, but if he wants to do what I want to do, I get 10,000 more results out of him than if I just sit there and play. Look, I got more strikes than you do. Now you do it. Sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes you come down to that where somebody's just a jackass and you have to. But leadership is getting people who want to follow you, and that's what Gates has done. I've known Gates for many years. He was in CIA as a Soviet analyst. I was in the State Department doing Soviet stuff. And I'm amazed at how fast he went, how far he went. I can tell you there's one funny story, and then I'll shut up. He was in Moscow, and I've always wanted to ask him this. He was in Moscow with the president and Gorbachev. And Gorbachev was then talking and asked him to see his watch. Well, Gates showed him his watch. Gorbachev put it on, and the rumor is Gates lost a watch. It had never been replaced till Gorbachev walked off with it. I asked Gorbachev when he was at K-State, and he sort of laughed and wouldn't answer me. I better shut up. There are other people who need to talk.
Yes, ma'am.
He can afford his own watch now.
My question is about executive privilege. Professor Rozell, you define executive privilege as generally accepted limited powers subject to a balancing test. Now, obviously, the fulcrum of that balance has varied from administration to administration. Looking at the Bush presidency, what are some of the, broadly speaking, some of the key factors which have tipped that balance towards executive privilege?
Bush's boldness in exercising this authority in a number of circumstances that I think broke new ground in terms of the definition of the proper scope of this constitutional principle. So Mitch was talking about, for example, in that part of our paper, the administration making the claim that it could withhold documents pertaining to investigations in the Justice Department, even in cases of long ago closed investigations. That was a unique argument. There's been a long-standing understanding that, of course, for cases of ongoing investigations, you don't want to compromise information that's critical to those investigations. So it's commonsensical, of course, that there should be some protection there. But the necessity of secrecy wanes over time as administrations leave office. Again, the argument that former presidents possess an Article II power of the presidency that they may exercise even in cases where the incumbent president disagrees with the decision of the former president, in that executive order, the decision of the former president would trump the incumbent president on the exercise of an Article II power of the presidency. Extending the power of executive privilege to the designated family representative of a former president in cases where former presidents may not be able to make the decisions themselves, which was at the time a concession to the Reagan situation, of course. But as one constitutional law scholar said when we were testifying on the Hill one afternoon, literally the pizza delivery guy called by Nancy Reagan could be given an Article II power of the presidency if she decided he's a designated representative of the family, to make this decision on behalf of, a dispute over Reagan-related papers. And then the whole matter of absolute immunity for current and even former administration officials. As Mitch was pointing out, it's more customary for administration officials to testify when called to do so. And if there are matters of great national import that would violate the principle of executive privilege, certainly on the order of the president, on instruction by the president, they could claim executive privilege in response to a question that would trench on presidential secrecy. But they can answer all the other questions that don't trench on presidential secrecy, which is probably going to be at least 95% or more of the exchange that goes on in that congressional hearing. So making the argument that they should not testify, that they should have absolute immunity because at some point a question may arise that trenches on presidential secrecy, I think just stretches credibility on the use of the principle of executive privilege. So my first publication academically years ago was called In Defense of Executive Privilege, and I ultimately wrote a book on the principle, which was largely a reaction against another book that disputed the existence of the principle of executive privilege. So I'm a believer in this concept as constitutionally grounded and necessary in many circumstances, yet I find myself over time increasingly appalled at the way that some presidents have applied this principle, particularly Nixon, Clinton, and current President Bush.